Hello and welcome to week 5. It's hard to believe that we're this close to the end, and so I encourage you stay faithful and stay strong as we get so close to the finish line. This week we'll be looking at framing and the reversal of preferences. So before we go any further, let's think a little bit more deeply about part of the title of chapter 5 where it says reversal of preferences. Let that sink in just for a minute. As you saw in the reading, humans can be swayed so much that they would completely reverse their preferences on a particular issue. Or in a worst case scenario, we can completely reverse our decision when faced with just a different framing, not even faced with different facts, but with a different framing of a particular situation. And so as organizational leaders, we need to be very careful to frame our most challenging issues in such a way that it's optimal for decision making. Let me explain a little bit of what I mean. Sometimes it's easy to go into a meeting knowing what you think is best and what you want the outcome to be, and so you frame the discussion, especially if you're the one in control or in charge of that particular meeting. It's easy to frame everything that happens so that everyone in the room goes along with a particular direction or a decision that you think they need to come down on, or a decision they need to make. When we do that, we're essentially ruling out the ability to make a better decision in many cases because we're eliminating those other perspectives, the other perceptions, the other feedback that could help us even realize that the decision we thought was right was in fact wrong. In fact, we may not even consciously be aware of that, and so we need to be on guard against it so that we're not being framed into the wrong decision ourselves, because we may frame ourselves in such a way that we're not thinking about it or allowing other thoughts to enter our cognitive processing in such a way that we can make an intelligent decision. So try looking at it from multiple frames would be a good way to overcome that. And like the book talked about, sometimes we can rephrase the question rather than, what do we stand to gain by doing this? Someone in the room ought to say, what do we stand to lose as a result of doing this? And just that simple change of wording there could help think through the scenario in a way that would enable a better decision, a more quality decision, and a decision that possibly won't be regretted in the near future. One of the really important concepts in this chapter was the topic of declining marginal utility. Now, that's a concept that's typically tied to economics, investments, and so on. But it really does apply, and I hope you saw in your reading how it applies to organizational leadership and decision making. And if you're not familiar with that concept, think of your last visit to a buffet, and I think the reading mentioned eating pizza. But when you go through a buffet line, one of my favorite activities, that first trip through brings lots of enjoyment, lots of satisfaction as you sit down and have that first plate of food. But that second plate doesn't bring the same incremental satisfaction in many cases. And at some point, if you keep going back and you get more and more plates, at some point there's a negative satisfaction that's happening. You're actually less satisfied because you went back too many times. Well, that's a simple way to look at it, and please don't think of it just in the realm of food or even dollars, like the book was talking about, because the same is true in many other contexts. And so the question I wanted to ask here that's kind of in addition to what you've been reading is, do we cheat our organizations when we apply this same kind of buffet-like mentality to incremental organizational decisions? And let me see if I can explain what I'm thinking there, and that is, someone who's been around an organization a long time, they've experienced the ups and downs, they've had some big victories, they've seen some wonderful things happen. And if they're the ones making a decision or influencing others about a particular decision, their own susceptibility to declining marginal utility could lead them to conclude that something is not worth an investment of resources, or is not worth the time or the personnel to pursue this new strategic opportunity. And their opinion of that to make that decision may be just simply a result of declining marginal utility in their own minds, rather than what's strategic and what's best and what truly is a gain for the organization. So we need to be aware of how we're influenced by this emotionally and mentally, sometimes and many times without any real awareness that that's happening. And sometimes that happens because we're looking at decisions one at a time. We're isolating those decisions, and then our emotions or our preconceived notions that are influenced by things like declining marginal utility cloud our ability to think about what's best for the organization. On page 86, the author said, the sequential nature of the decision-making processes in organizations is likely to enhance the potential for inconsistency and non-rational choice. Managers may go along making individual decisions that each seem sensible, but when viewed as a whole are obviously suboptimal. In other words, when we make this decision, move on to the next decision, then we move on to the next decision, we're susceptible to irrational conclusions or inconsistency about, well, how did you make this decision and it's so different than what you did over here, because we're just doing one-offs, or we're doing one decision at a time. And the author is suggesting that we step back and look at that more systematically, to make bigger level, higher level strategic decisions that would lead us to a more consistent approach. And that really does segue to the next point I wanted to make here. And that is that we should avoid isolated decisions. Those irrational or inconsistent choices that the quote was talking about can be alleviated through traditional strategic planning. As much as some of us hate that exercise, or you may think of it as just something where you're producing a binder that's going to sit on a shelf somewhere, we may miss out on the fact that those exercises help us see our decisions in a much bigger scale, in the bigger picture, the grander scheme of things, in order to avoid these pitfalls that are often more dangerous to us when we're making one decision at a time, totally disconnected from other decisions that need to be made. And so we need to step back and imagine what the organization needs to look like in the future and how this decision is going to get us there. And on an individual level, we should step back and imagine how your future self, myself 10 years from now, or 5 years from now, 1 year from now, how am I going to evaluate this decision when I look back and say, we really should have thought about this in a different way, or we should have gone about this a different method. But hopefully you get my point. I'm getting a little bit off track there, but the bottom line is that a lot of these biases that we're talking about, especially in chapter 5, can be minimized if we will step back, if we will look at the bigger picture, and if we'll think more strategically long term than just this decision one at a time, moving on to the next decision, and not learning as we go, not connecting all of those decisions together. And one of the points in the reading was also about this desire that we have for certainty, or at least pseudo-certainty. But we need to remember the obvious, and that is certainty is just simply impossible. It's the world we live in. Now that will change one day when we're in heaven and everything is perfect and we're free from the effects of sin and the fall. But that is not what we're living in today, and so we need to realize that certainty is just simply not a luxury that we will have, at least not the way we often think of it or seek it. So decision factors that were mentioned in the reading, and maybe as you're coming up with your own strategic decision-making model, you may have certain factors that you're going to evaluate, and so often those can be quantified and mathematically evaluated. Going this direction will give us a return of 40%, going this direction is 30%, so of course we're going to go for 40. But even the most quantifiable issues, no matter how much data you pull and no matter how many statistics you use to support it and quantify a particular decision, it still comes with some uncertainty. There's no guarantee, as we all know. So don't let the uncertainty cloud your judgment and lead you toward really poor decisions, especially poor financial decisions. That's where we are most susceptible when it comes to this danger of seeking certainty. And it leads people to do what the book mentioned as an example, in their own personal lives, they purchase these extended warranties on everything they buy, computers and cars and other things. And when you do the math, they simply don't add up. No economist would evaluate an extended warranty and say, yeah, this is the right financial decision for you as an individual. And when we begin to think that way and carry it into our organizations where we're so fearful of the uncertain, or so fearful of the potential loss or the risk and that sort of thing, we can spend far too much of our time and money and other resources trying to guard against those risks that we miss the strategic opportunities that are right in front of us. And so there's a balance there. Obviously, we don't want to be reckless. We don't want to be so risk-seeking that we put our organizations in jeopardy. But we don't want to be so risk-averse that we avoid the opportunities, or we miss the opportunities that are laid right out for us to take advantage of. And so that's a delicate balance. There's not a right answer. I can't give you the answer on this slide of how you need to handle this in your setting or in your particular organization. But it is something that you can use your discernment as you learn, and as you have more and more experience, and as you have more awareness of this issue, that you can improve the decision-making quality related to certainty, uncertainty, pseudo-certainty, and so forth. Well, if you know me at all by now, you knew I couldn't pass up some of the final points in this chapter. And by the way, the conclusions are always a great place to really focus and spend some extra time reading through those conclusions at the end of the chapters, because that's where you really see what's been most important in the material. But in this particular chapter, the authors made a few existential points that I wanted to mention. I thought they were a little beyond the scope of the chapter in some ways, but not in a bad way. I just wanted to point out a couple of points. And one is a pretty exciting point, and that is that as he's talking about some of the challenges we have with things like declining marginal utility, he says it's because we're not infinite, and we don't have the ability to enjoy all these pleasures without some kind of decline. And he says there our subjective utility scale is not infinitely sensitive. Well, I would add to that, at least not yet. For a believer, we look forward to a place, an eternity in heaven, where we will never see declining marginal utility. We'll be able to enjoy and maybe even incrementally grow in that enjoyment of pleasure forever, free from pain. And so that's an exciting point that I think is important to mention as we read a secular author's view of things, and we see the limitations that we're subject to here as humans on the earth. But one day we'll be free from that, and that's pretty exciting. But the second point is in a sense sad when it comes to the human state, and that's the point I've mentioned here in the quote, where he says that we as humans are motivated to seek more, believing that it will make us happier. Thus we find ourselves on a hedonic treadmill in which we strive for an imagined happiness that forever slips out of our grasp, beckoning us onward. Well, what he's really saying there is that we are often motivated to keep pushing for more and more and more because we want to find that pleasure. And every time that pleasure wears off, we have to go for more. And that's why millionaires just need another dollar. That's why billionaires just need another dollar. And they never find that perfect fulfillment, that satisfaction that the Bible has been saying for thousands of years we can't find in material things. Stuff cannot satisfy. And so it's just another affirmation of the truth that's always been there for us. If we will believe the simplicity of God's word and see that these things won't satisfy, and we can't seek satisfaction in these things without finding ourselves on a treadmill that will be very discouraging. He's talking like it's going to motivate us somehow, but what you often see is that discouragement, that depression, that longing for something more that just can't be obtained. And he even mentions there that many discover that it's just impossible. So I close this lecture with just an encouragement for each of you to be aware of these limitations that we have, do everything we can in our reading and our learning to minimize these pitfalls and deal with these shortcomings that we have, but also take hope in knowing that there is so much more beyond this life and beyond this world. And that ought to give us a better perspective, an eternal perspective beyond this life, beyond the circumstances we see around us, and allow us to make decisions based on that. It will actually be the right decisions because we're viewing them through the lens of eternity, not through the lens of this cyclical treadmill that leads to disappointment when there's not something bigger beyond the simple facts right in front of us. Well, that's the end of my soapbox for this week, and I wish you well as you work through this material and watch the other videos and participate in the discussion board. As always, please reach out and let me know if you have any questions or if there's any way I can serve you. Stay faithful.